Here we go. So, hello, everybody who's listening to this call. I'm Mary Alice Arthur, and I'm speaking with Jack O'Sullivan. And both of us were on the Youth and Elders sailing trip on the Baltic, and we decided we'd have a little conversation about what called us to come there and what we learned about it, just to debrief with each other and actually to share with you. So, we're just going to start off with a bit of an introduction to ourselves so you can hear something about our background, and then we'll get into what brought us to the trip itself. So maybe, Jack, how about you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Jack O'Sullivan. I'm a biologist by training, and I'm still a biologist and still work as a freelance environmental consultant in Ireland, having worked abroad for many years in different places. I have a deep interest in human society, how we have evolved, and what we're doing to the planet. Because it seems to me that unless we change the direction of our society, unless we move from our current exploitative relationship with the earth, we're clearly going to do and are doing a lot of damage. So I would be a person who would be more on the environmental side, on the green side, than on, let's say, on the corporate side. And this is reflected in my client group. I tend to work a lot for small local groups opposing projects, mainly in Ireland, trying to make sure that incinerators don't happen where they would be very damaging, that very nasty landfills are closed up, and so on and so forth. But that's my background, essentially. The other background, which is also relevant, is I love the sea, love sailing, and grew up on the coast of County Cork, where I had a small boat for many years. And that also had an influence in why I joined the Youth and Elders Project. Now, how about you, Mary Alice?
Well, I've been a facilitator for the past, since 1995, so that's been quite some time now. And although now I would call myself a host, really, I love to host containers for great conversations, and I use powerful questions, conversational methodologies that help people really participate well, and story, the use of story for people, helping people to find out what they're really passionate about, what works and doesn't work, because we tend to hold our experiences in story form inside of us. It's just a very human thing to do. And with that, we can, when we use those three things, stories, conversation, and questions, we can come into the situation where we can make sense and meaning together. And that's a really powerful thing to begin to question what's our common ground, what's our higher ground, how do we create wise action together. I'm really interested in what helps us step in instead of step away, and especially at this point in time in the world where there's a real shake going on around our old structures and our old ways of doing things, and so many people say, we've got to do it a different way. Okay, so how does that way happen? I think if we look at conversation as a basic form of how humans communicate and interact together, but also as a transformational methodology and medium, then it makes it really interesting. It's something we know how to do. So how do we move away from debate and argument and polarized perspectives and kind of come into conversation? Because the word conversation means you're willing to learn something from somebody else. So I've gone all over the place, really interested in working with groups of all kinds, a lot in the corporate world, some in community. I'm really interested in now the really big questions and big conversations. And I'm an intentional nomad at this point in time in my life. I was born in the States, as you can probably hear from my accent, and currently I'm sitting at a friend's place in Chicago, so this is the background. But I've spent 28 years living in New Zealand, so I've had more than half my lifetime outside of my country of origin. And now I travel to people and places to work with them, to invigorate them, to witness them. And it's an interesting thing. So I think part of my role is to bring good process to places, and another part is to be a story catcher, to catch the stories where they're happening and take them to where they need to be. So this whole question of eldership came up for me, maybe a year ago or more, when suddenly I felt kind of grabbed by the grandmother energy. To kind of look around and go, how old are you? Is anybody else? Because I don't have children of my own or a family, so that surprised me, but I am of that age where it's interesting to think about eldership and to think about stewardship and to think about how we can work together on the planet. So all of these things kind of came into alignment with the Youth and Elders Project. So, Jack, when you think about back then, it feels like a long time ago. Although we are recording this in August and we went in June, so it actually isn't that long ago. But time is I find time interesting right at the moment. But what really attracted you to go on this particular trip? I know you said you love sailing, and I witnessed that when we were on board the trip. You were like in your element. But what else attracted you?
Well, two things, Mary Alice, two things coming together. First of all, it was the sailing. That was very, very true for me. To be on a sailing ship for a week, now the very thought of that was enough to make me go. But on top of that, and this would be the crucial thing, was the idea of youth and elders coming together. That a disparate group of people from a wide variety of backgrounds should get together and talk about stuff. Now, unfortunately, I knew very little about the art of hosting. I didn't know about Learning Village. I didn't know about story catching and transferring of stories, but which for me are very, very powerful tools now that I've come into contact with them through you. But the idea of a group of people from different countries, of different ages, sharing experiences and talking about something wider than themselves as well, talking about what's happening in the world generally, was for me a very strong pull factor. So I said, I'm joining this voyage, and I did. What about you, Mary Alice? Did you have similar reasons, or did you have other reasons?
Well, so I said that just before that the eldership conversation was up for me, and I was kind of waiting around, like you do when you're interested in something, waiting around to go, how's this going to manifest? What's okay, I'm interested in this, but what's the next step with it? And I met Benjamin Kafka, who's one of the trio of guys who are holding this project, when we did an Art of Hosting training in Berlin last November. Although he didn't mention it, we were so focused on that training, I think we didn't come into conversation about this. But then I met Mark Beanland in December. We had a community of practice meeting in Copenhagen, and he brought this project there, and we were doing what's called a Proaction Cafe, which is where we kind of hothouse ideas and help each other with how do you take that forward. And he said, I really want to work on this. And we had too many projects for the number of people, but we sat together over lunch, and he told me about it, and I went, ooh, that sounds really, really interesting. And then later on, at the beginning of this year, we were in Copenhagen at the same time, all three of us. We were meeting at my favorite tea place called Tante Te, the place where you can get lots of different teas, and not very far from the Copenhagen railway station. And we'd had a conversation about stuff, and they just turned to me and they said, you know what, we feel more grounded and more able to do this kind of work when you're around. Will you come with us? And I really heard that sincere invitation, and I work very much on invitation. So I came in with the intention, I'm going to support this hosting team to do really good work, and I'm going to hold the edges around the group. So I didn't really have any idea much about the project, and I'm the opposite of you. I was like, uh-oh, I have to go sailing. I don't have the clothes for this. I don't have the gear. What if I'm seasick for 4 days? Oh, I was just totally freaked out about that end of it. But I had heard the invitation strongly enough, and I had responded to it strongly enough that then I was kind of in. I had to rely on, they're going to find me the gear, and it's all going to be okay. So I kind of got on the boat with a bit of fear and trepidation. But I really was interested in the conversation, and I'm interested in how this kind of thing works. So that made me say yes. Okay, so now we got ourselves on the boat. And when you think about the trip itself, so it's a week at sea, sailing out of Greifswald in Germany, going kind of to Denmark and Sweden, and then right into Poland. And so there's a lot of different learnings. I mean, there's learning on the edge of being in a new group. How do you do that when you don't know these people, and you have to eat with them and sleep with them and sail with them, do whatever you're doing with them. Then there's that level of the conversation itself, youth and elders and things like that. So the dynamics of the group, the conversation itself, the wider question of this work in general in the world. I mean, there's a lot to learn there. So what did you learn in this trip?
It's hard. I found it very hard to sum up, Mary Alice, what I learned. Quite hard. Because I didn't learn anything specific that would easily be pinned down. I found myself, for a week, on a sailing vessel, with a lovely group of people. And they're very quite distinct and quite an amazing crowd. What I found was how well we tended to work together and to be together. And I did learn very much from yourself because, as I was saying there a moment ago, before that voyage, I'd never heard of the art of hosting. I'd never heard of story catching. I'd never heard of World Cafe, but all these now seem to be so powerful and so needed today that what I learned was these ideas, these tools, these methodologies exist. And even for that was a big step. Then I learned that it is possible for people to get together who are comparative strangers at the beginning of a voyage, and like the voyage becoming a microcosm for something else, by the end of the voyage, we knew enough about each other to be kind of almost caring for each other and to be willing to spend time with each other and to somehow be concerned and interested in each other as people, which was very, very important too as well. Because I get involved occasionally, well, more than occasionally, quite a lot with environmental groups who are actively striving for some great ideal. And what takes over is the mission, the project, the objective. And there's nothing in those groups about the people themselves. How do they come to be there? How do they relate to each other as persons, even though many of them are superb and courageous? And it seemed to me that the voyage, and yourself in particular, has put a slightly different angle on this, that we need to relate as people before we can work together to secure a wider objective. Did you feel that in any way at all, Mary Alice, that kind of feeling?
Yes, and I'd take that even further, I guess, because from a point of view of holding the group, because I wasn't responsible for the content, the guys who called this project or holding this project, that gave me an amount of freedom to really be present to what was there. So on the one side, I, just like yourself, how do we relate as people? So the human dynamic, and I think I took it even further in my own mind, even this idea of the healing we need as people, as groups, as a planet, before we can just jump into task. A lot of people go, let's get on with the work. But when the going gets hard, then what is going to keep you going is the connection, the relationship. I've heard that often around resilience, resilient communities, that a resilient community is not one that has more resources than the other, it's one that's better connected than the other. Because when you're more connected, then you want to give to the center. So it's not all about, the mission runs away with everything and you sacrifice everything, including yourself. But that there's a balance. If you look at it as a continuum, I'm just going to pick up a pen here just to use it as a continuum of, this end being the task end and this end being the people end, that both of these are equally balanced, and the journey is almost like this lovely figure eight or infinity symbol between people and task. And that way you get something really good done and the people get looked after. So I was really aware each of us were carrying stories, and some of us had larger trauma stories around whatever that was, and we tended to gravitate to the people who could listen us into our own balance, I suppose I'd say. So I noticed clusters of people forming and reforming, which were those who were best able to support each other at the time. So that's one thing I noticed. And since that time I've noticed, because that woke me up to that kind of pattern, I've really noticed the healing needed in groups and in groups I've been with since then. And I think it's a bigger pattern right across the planet. That doesn't mean we need to fix stuff, but we need to listen deeply to each other and make safe enough spaces that we can lean into pain or trauma or anger or whatever it is and not be overwhelmed by it. And then I think the second thing I really saw was eldership has nothing to do with age. So here we are, kind of two of the more senior people on the team, I guess. But actually I've begun to realize eldership has everything to do with wisdom and not much to do with age. So you can be older and be still very, very naive or childlike or even foolish, I suppose. And you can be younger and be quite wise. I remember a long time ago speaking to a 12-year-old with 150 IQ, thinking, whoa, there's a really intelligent person who may not be taken seriously because he's only 12. But what if he could make a contribution? So that whole thing about how do we hold space, so as a facilitator or as a host, I'm really wondering, how do we hold space for the elder of the moment, the one who's holding the wisdom, to actually step forward and be honored because they're holding what we need now, rather than who we think they are, what their age is, or any of that kind of stuff. So, and that, I guess, is predicated on a field of relationship, being able to, number one, listen to each other deeply enough to find that wisdom, but number two, to be open to emergence enough that we allow it to come forward when it's there, with whoever it's there with, I suppose. So that's number two thing. And I guess number three thing for me learning was how challenging it can be being in a different environment. So as a facilitator, I'm used to working in rooms. I actually facilitated something on board an inter-island ferry once, but a ferry is a much bigger thing than a two-masted sailing ship. So we had to have a conversation as a team beforehand. What happens if all of the hosting team is seasick at the same time? How does the process go on? And I just never had to think about that before in my life. What if I'm seasick? So we devised this way of, if we had a question for each day, a place to post the question in the galley so that everybody could see it and continue working, even if we were, number one, all sick, or number two, we were on a long sail and we were on the watches. We were on different crews and therefore could never gather as a single group. So the dynamic of working in this kind of space was just new to me and quite different. And I came to the conclusion from that it's like you need to build the foundation first. You need to come into who are we and why are we here and what is this topic before you get overwhelmed by having to sail the ship or having to do the task or whatever it is you do. That you need the foundation, again, of relationship, connection, and interaction with the topic so that you can actually keep doing that while you are doing a task. And a task can be really helpful in giving you focus. So I think those are some learnings. So as I'm saying those, anything else occurring to you that kind of popped up on this trip?
I'm just trying to think an answer to that, because you've said a lot. The one thing that occurs to me now, of course, is how vitally important this approach is all over the world. I see the need for it in Ireland very, very much, where I work now and again with local groups who are, as I said, opposing some development. But last night I was attending a public meeting organised by people who live in Northwest Mayo, where Shell, the infamous oil company, but not the worst, has created an intolerable situation. But the intolerable situation dates right back to a time when a very large gas field off that northwest coast of Ireland was given away by a minister who was subsequently jailed for corrupt practices. And what that minister did, along with his fellow politicians, was to dismantle a previous fairly normal system under which if an oil company finds a field of oil or gas, the state takes a share, the company pays petroleum royalties, and then pays tax. That particular minister changed the rules. The state takes no share of the field whatsoever. The oil company takes 100%. There are no petroleum royalties, and the company can write off all its exploration costs and development costs against tax, and therefore probably ends up paying no tax. And to cap it all, to add insult to injury, the oil company was given land by the government in a special area of conservation, or adjacent to a special area of conservation, so that to bring the gas ashore, they had to drill a pipeline through a special area of conservation, which is supposed to be protected. And did the state protect it? No. Local people start to oppose. This goes back now, nearly 8 or 9 years. And local people said, we're not allowing this. Now, our police force is normally a fairly decent crowd, but the police force acted with the incredible brutality there. One of the principal people who took part in this, a man called Pat O'Donnell, told us last night at the public meeting that he saw a neighbour of his being thrown to the ground and kicked by police. He went to this man's rescue. He was then grabbed by 2 more police, one at each side of him, who pulled his arms behind him and hit him across the mouth with a baton, thereby knocking out his teeth. And his teeth having been knocked out, Pat had to go to hospital. He was then faced with a charge in the court of attacking the police, which of course was wrong, and they had, quotation marks, a video to prove it. Then, said Pat O'Donnell, we looked at that video, we got an expert from London who was able to identify the fact that the video had been tampered with and the evidence adjusted by the police in order to gain a conviction. Now, with the help of that expert and some more mistakes made by the police, the case was thrown out. But the clear example here is that corruption, when it begins, ends up everywhere. Police become corrupted, courts become corrupted. Back to a central question. That community is incredibly resilient. And I often wonder why. Because they've stood up to the forces of the state. They stood up to the media, lashing them as, oh, dreadful people trying to stop gas coming ashore, which will bring a lot of good to Ireland. They stood up to police brutality. And the company which is bringing the gas ashore, Shell, has something like 200, quotation marks, security men on the site day and night. And if you live in that area, and you want to go out to examine your sheep or see if a cow is calved, you are watched 24 hours a day by security men looking at you through binoculars. So I wonder to myself, what makes a community like that so resilient, so courageous, that they put everything on the line, even to going to jail, to stand up against what they see as the exploitation of resources. They see resources being given away by the state that are no longer of any benefit to the people because they're gone. Why? And then the big question, why did subsequent governments not tear up that agreement between the oil company and the minister, which after was made by a minister who went to jail for corruption? And why is the whole thing not renegotiated? Nobody had any answer to that. So I look at that as a kind of thing that one of many examples worldwide. We had a speaker, by the way, too, last night from Nigeria, who told us what is happening down there. And that's also very, very horrific. So we're living in a time at the moment when I will say certain large organizations, be it governments or corporations, see it almost as their right to impose their will on people. And if people attempt to, how would I put it, use their right to say we don't want that development, then whole forces of state and everyone else is brought to bear on them in order to try and hammer them into the ground. A very difficult situation. How do such people be given the power and the courage, because I admire the courage of the people in Mayo, to try and fight that kind of thing. And this is where maybe the kind of methodologies that you're talking about could be used to help and empower communities. I love the word empowerment, by the way. I would be a fan of Joanna Macy, who wrote, Despair and Empowerment in the Nuclear Age. She looked at why communities across the world, in the United States as well, did nothing when faced with the threat of nuclear warfare. And my own view, whatever it is that human beings are quite good at dealing with immediate threats. If somebody is going to knock you on the head, you're going to either kick him or you're going to run away as fast as you can. But we're not good at dealing with long-term insidious threats. So, for example, our evolutionary history has not, I think, empowered us to really deal with something like global warming, which you can't see it coming. We know we cause it, every one of us who drives cars or burns coal or oil, but how you actually deal with it demands a coherent strategy involving everyone. And we failed completely to achieve that. So we need a new way of thinking, a new way of living, a new way of relating to the planet. And what you're doing is a part of that, I think. Would you agree, Mary Alice, with what I've said, or am I completely off the ball?
I think you're right, and of course I'm seeing it from my viewpoint, but I think the muscle to work well together, to build capacity and community, and I think the other thing you're alluding to is the question about returning to a focus on citizenship. How do you actually kind of take responsibility? So if I bring this back to youth and elders, I've often thought, we used to talk about in the United States the donut effect, the way that the center of communities died out almost and everything went to the suburbs. But I think if I look at how community used to be structured, we've had the donut effect there too, because we used to be a circle. The youngers and the olders need each other. The youngers need wisdom, they need stories, they need to know where they came from, they need to have the longer range view that you can only get when you're old enough to not be really worried about your own thing all the time, to be thinking on a broader level. But in exchange, it's like the elders need the enthusiasm, the energy, the power, the vision, the fun that young people give them. I remember watching my own father when the first grandchild was born, and my youngest sister said to my dad, "What happened to you? Scrooge used to live in this house." And my dad looked very sheepish and he said, "Rachel," who's my niece. When she came along, something very significant busted open in him, I guess. So there I could see the power of the youngers and the olders together. And when we make our elders elderly and we put them in old folks' homes, and we take our young people because the parents are having to work all the time and put them in care, then these two elements of society, which should be bonded together and which should be giving to each other, that particular thing is broken. So again, we have the donut effect, but now we have a broken donut with a real hole in the middle. So our society has a hole in the middle because we're all busy out working all the time chasing money to have more staff, I guess, in the Western world. And who's looking after the old and the young who need each other so much? So I think when I look at a donut, if you can imagine the shape of a donut, it's the same shape as a torus,
Yes.
Torus, a torus. And the torus is that kind of energetic field which moves like that, which I believe I've seen as the energetic field around humans and is also the energetic field around the planet. And the interesting thing for me about that pattern as I've been thinking about it is that continue, and if you look on Wikipedia, there's a really nice view of it in movement, that things come to the center, and then you need to go to the edge again and get the innovation, and then you bring the innovation back to the center. And so the center and the edge are actually equal. It's not more important to be in the center than on the edge, because on the edge is when we have the new stuff. So I felt kind of like we were on board this ship on the edge. And for me, it had that effect of, I felt like I became totally present because there was no internet, there was no anything else's distraction. I came up out of the hatch in the morning and I was surrounded by sea, and I kind of went, oh, so this is my current reality. And there's Jack at the helm. Things must be going well.
Sometimes, Mary Alice.
You were there looking happy.
You're right about the torus. I find the torus to be a lovely figure because there are no edges. If you could imagine a gigantic torus and you're walking on the surface, you could walk everywhere.
Yeah.
Where you would not find an edge anymore, you'll find an edge on the earth. And you're talking about the donut effect. I remember reading about this many years ago in the book Urban Dynamics by Professor Jay Forrester from MIT. And he showed, and I've seen it happening in Ireland until we were able to change things, how city will die at the centre and people move out of the suburbs. And then the inner part of the city falls apart, becomes occupied by people living in very poor neighbourhoods, buildings become run down, and you get this kind of edge effect. That's because the city's on a flat surface. But you also mentioned about the chain. I remember reading, I think, in the continuum concept by Jean Liedloff many years ago, how you must have that continuous chain from grandparents to parents to children. And it's not just parents teach children, as you know. Grandparents also have a powerful effect. And you know what we're doing in Ireland? It is horrific. We are following that Western European trend, which is very strange to us, but it's happening big time. We're putting old people into residential homes, not operated by the state in many cases, but operated for profit by people. And every couple of weeks we hear about one of them being investigated by our health and safety executive and found to be completely a bad place to live. The other day, for example, there was an investigation of one single home, and there were 3 investigations of it, and they found old people living there in clothing which hadn't been washed, they hadn't been bathed for a month, they weren't getting the proper medication, and the staff hadn't been vetted for their ability to do the work properly and to care after these old people. All because whoever ran that home probably thought, oh, I can make money. I'll be getting so much a week per person, it'll cost me so much to run it, big profit at the end of the year. So we've turned the business of caring from caring to profit making. And I think corporate greed and the placing of money before everything else is one of the most damaging things we are doing at the moment. And a lot flows from that. I don't know if you agree, Mary Alice. I brought money into it now, which is the only subject of discussion on our radio and TV in Ireland for the last 2 years.
What it makes me think is that we've fallen into a pervasive storyline. In fact, that's so pervasive that we don't see it. And when I look at it, I think of it. If I think of it in the most basic terms, then money is only a system of value. I mean, you exchange it for something. You can't eat it. It certainly makes poor wallpaper. So, it doesn't have any intrinsic value. It's a mode of value exchange. So and it's an agreement, just like all of us celebrating Christmas at the same time is an agreement. It's nothing more than that. You can change agreements. So it's an interesting thing to look at. Could we change our agreements? Could we move to something different? Could we decide it could be another way? And what's the story we're willing to entertain in order for that to be true? Like this culture I'm sitting in right at the moment, which has a very high attention to violence. And that's coming through all types of mediums. But we could agree that it might be different and that we don't want to focus on those kind of things. And therefore, movies like The Dark Knight or whatever, we don't want to see those anymore because the violence they portray is not what we want to have in our society. But so that leads me to that question of what is a mature society? Because that's kind of an interesting one. What is it if we take the focus on money and the focus on what your body looks like and all of those kind of things, that seems like quite an adolescent type of focus. What you look like, what you're doing, how much money you have, would seem to me to be a younger focus than a mature kind of focus about what is good for life, what is good for the society, what is good for the generations to come. So, when you think about that concept of mature society, can you think of any, or what would a mature society be, I guess is a question.
I can. I haven't really had time to think an awful lot about this because determining what a mature society is depends on your own view and on the culture at which you've come. But if I was to start on what a mature society might be, I would say it's a society that places caring and healing at a very, very high level. Much more important than making money. Caring for each other, caring for the planet, caring for people who might be less well off, caring for people who are undergoing struggles, and giving a lot of time and resources to this caring effort, and looking at other living beings on the planet as basically creatures whom we have a responsibility to take care of, because we don't own the planet. It's not even we live on it, we evolved out of it. So we couldn't possibly have evolved as intelligent thinking beings unless there was a complex environment full of other creatures to give us that kind of complexity which gave our brains the stimulus to become the brain we have now. So very much a caring society, one that where things like possessions are useful for what they are, not to be traded as, do I have a bigger car than you have, or we have a bigger house than the crowd down the road, and where there's a lot of awareness that material things are only so far, that, let's call it, what do you want to call it, spiritual or not, but that there's another realm of life which is equally important. So those two things for a start, and I think from that an awful lot would flow, a huge amount. What else would we say is a mature society? Well, I don't even have a definition of maturity, but again I'd say a society where resorting to violence is probably much, much less frequent. There will be people who resort to violence, where we see the formation of the individual as a primary thing. So if some individual is being malformed through a dysfunctional family, there's sufficient resources to go in there and help that dysfunctional family to avoid the transmission of violence by behavior from one generation to the next, from one community right down to the next one, and so on. Because you see in many places, you see this in Ireland, you see it all over the world, where there's a particular area with a high number of dysfunctional families. What happens? A high level of crime. Young people go into prison, They come out, they turn to crime again. They in turn pass on that mode of behavior. I don't think it's genetic. They pass on that mode of behavior to their kids. And so you get down through generation after generation, seeds of violence being sown. Now, I always believe that if it might be possible over several generations to take care of that, to try and how do I put it, not stop it completely, that's very difficult, but to minimize it. And that means a mature society will be one which looks ahead. You're not year, but you're looking in terms of, well, human beings have been around here for 3 million years and we've become so-called civilized only the last couple of thousand. We should be thinking, what kind of society do we want in 100 years' time? We can't imagine it, but let's work towards a society that at least will be, in some way, better. And I don't mean better materially. I mean, looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, better in terms of self-realization, in terms of self-expression, in terms of, again, caring for each other than we are now. That would be my beginning of the debate on a mature society. You might, Mary Alice, have a lot more and more interesting stuff on the same topic.
I was listening to a podcast recently that talked about our belief that when one of the most important sentences in human existence, cognito ergo sum, which is translated, I think, therefore I am, but actually if you look at the root of the word cognito, it comes out of two different Latin words, and actually the literal translation is, I shake things up, therefore I am.
Yes.
And that's actually kind of interesting. So it's not about the fact that we think, because I've been seeing that a lot of research recently has been talking about animals thinking, but we are the only animals that can't be who we are. A horse is a horse. It doesn't
Always.
try to. Yeah, it
we
doesn't
can
try
be
to
almost
be something.
anything we want to.
Yeah, but we can get lost in that. We can get lost in trying to be something else. So that interesting thing about if it is true that you are a unique individual, therefore the package of goods and talents you hold is unique in all the world. There's nobody born at exactly the same time as you, even if you're a twin. So what if we turned to stewardship and we knew each of us was stewarding something on behalf of the whole and we were inviting each other to bring it, and therefore families would be stewarding something on behalf of the community, and communities would be stewarding something on behalf of the land, and regions and nations would be stewarding stuff, then how we treated ourselves and each other would be quite different. So I think this, for me, if I look at some of the, for example, the Native American practices I've seen, where actually life was good. They didn't spend a lot of their life working. You gathered your food in a certain amount of time. Then there was time to be with family and to contemplate the nature of spirit and reality. And spirit was seen to be in everything. So everything was actually equal. You were related to all other beings. And there's a whole different focus on life when that is true. So there's something for me right now about the need to bring life back into the center of focus, and that a mature society would be doing that, would be saying, is what we're doing actually, how is that impacting on the next 7 generations? Because that's a long, long time period. And I remember going past one of the Occupy movements in Cincinnati, which had a big sign up saying, a corporation is not a person. It's like the law has kind
but
of
we've
turned.
Done that.
Yeah.
We've done that legally, Mary Alice. I think one of the things I remember reading about some years ago was at the root of a lot of problems is the fact that the United States legislation, and the same, I guess, in any other country, it gives a corporation the same power and the same rights as a person in law. And that does seem to be a problem. You mentioned something else there too, which was arousing a point in my own mind. One problem with a society which could be very wise and very mature, a danger, a pitfall, becoming too ordered. I think we need a little bit of chaos in society.
Yes.
Because otherwise we won't get unique individuals springing up, we won't get new art forms, we won't need people who are a little bit different going out and saying, I don't care about society, I want to do my own thing. And they could turn out to be doing some remarkable stuff. If society becomes a little bit too organized and too
we've all got to be like this,
then I think we'd lose an awful lot.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I would, because I think nature gives us a perfect role model there. It's all about diversity.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the richness of diversity and kind of maximum diversity, and all of the and everything having the place that it's needed to help the and every system helping another system. Otherwise, it doesn't survive. So I love the new Chalmouth tribe in the northwest coastal area of North America who depend on hunting together because they hunt large things like whales, and you cannot do that by yourself. So their little maxim, which has left them well over 10,000 years, is he who cannot ask for help. No, it is kind to ask for help. He who cannot ask for help cannot be trusted.
So that's a very good one. Yeah, yeah.
It is kind to ask for help. I love that really very much. And that whole, can we turn back to kindness? Can we turn back to helping each other? Can we put life at the center?
Well, our evolutionary history has equipped us to work together. And without work, if you look at the human being, we have no armor, we have no body defenses, we have no particular weaponry that other living creatures have to secure their food, to hunt. We only have the ability to work together, which we must have done for 1 million years in the forests and open plains of Africa. We hunted large animals. We learned to work together to do that. At the same time, there was, of course, competition. And this balance in working together and competition has always seemed to me to be very important. You can stress the competitive element, which we're doing in today's world. Get out there and be competitive. Grow your business, we're told. Or everything becomes competitive. And that, I think, is where the competition end of this spectrum that you put on your pen a while ago, you've got working together and you've got competitiveness. And the competitiveness is far too strong. We need to redress that balance.
Or move into co-opetition, they call that.
Co-opetition. Never heard of it, but sounds a good word.
Yeah, that's the blend of cooperation and competition. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But I'm just to get us right back to youth and elders. I think it's an important time in the planet for youth and elders to work together, and and to see that both are important and to really step in. And I'm hoping for this project that more opportunities for extending this conversation happen, more times for people to come together, more kind of international nature of this kind of inquiry, because I think it's a really important one.
I agree. It is very important. Actually, like a lot of times on the planet when people are faced with some huge dilemma, it might have happened many a time during our previous history. We've been faced with being on the cusp of a change. But this one is a little bit different because for the first time in human history, we have formed, as Teilhard de Chardin would call it, the noosphere. In other words, thinking minds right across the entire world connected by the internet. And I think the internet is an amazing thing in that way because governments can't control it. No longer can governments say, this isn't happening, because somebody's out there with a mobile phone, a small camera, recording it, and it's up on YouTube before the governments can even stop it. Stop the information being disseminated out. So there's enormous power to people these days, which is new, and the way people can communicate right across the globe at great speeds. Now, of course, that in turn, like everything else, has created problems as well. The internet is used by all kinds of people who want to do pretty horrible things. But on the whole, I would think that we're at a unique point when we can utilize these tools that you've been mentioning, and we should be utilizing them to gain a greater awareness of where we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's all about intention. And,
are you?
Yeah, and I'm wondering. You've worked with a lot of activists about. Just as a last question, it's easy to be against something. I think it's harder to be for something. And I remember standing in line once with someone from Israel saying, "I think Israel has a fighting against story. Do you think it would be possible to change the fighting bit?" And she thought a little bit, and she said no. And I said, "Do you think it would be possible to change against to for?" And she said, yes.
Yeah.
So that little fundamental difference about what's our intention and what do we really hope, I think makes all the difference. So if you could make a wish for the Youth and Elders Project, what would it be, just as our final thing together?
To envision I think it's very important, as you say, not to be fighting against, but fighting for. And I often look at groups of people, and it's very hard to switch from fighting against to fighting for. Because when you fight for something, you have to envision what you're fighting for. And that demands a leap of the imagination. Otherwise, you're just fighting to go back to where you were. I often contrast, say, in the north of Ireland, which I'm fairly familiar, the nationalists are fighting for a different country. The unionists are fighting to go back to the situation where they had for 50 years single-party government, shipyard giving employment, and so on and so forth. And it's very hard for them to actually switch out of that mode to something completely new. The youth and elders, what should we be looking for? Some way, we have to sit down actually and envision this way, and this might be the subject of our next physical get-together as opposed to electronic get-together. Looking for some way in which the concept of youth and elders could spread out, either by us spawning off other groups, and with the idea that we use it to envision the kind of society we want, where we get there, and how we get there. If Donella Meadows was alive, and I think she was a great woman who lived in the East Coast, I remember her saying in the Limits to Growth study that the best tools we have in order to get out of the problem of a society that's going to literally collapse in and of itself, she said, truth-telling and envisioning and learning from the earth. Those three things. Now, if we could marry those with the youth and elders and have our next meeting maybe either on a ship again, that would be lovely, or somewhere where we were working with the earth as a counterbalance to our cerebral thinking. But let's look at the term envisioning. That to me is the way of going ahead for youth and elders. Maybe?
And I guess for me, I would wish for this project that it becomes one of those strange attractors that encourages people to think differently, to be curious, to want to talk to other people, to want to do stuff together, to want to share. And that, it's about going out there and having more fun.
Yes, having more fun is very important. I remember learning once from a guy who was walking across Ireland. He was a French Canadian. He said, boredom is a mortal sin. And there should be an element of fun in everything we do. Otherwise, it becomes a drag, it becomes boring. So, yes, let's do it and have fun.
Yeah, I heard someone say once, if it isn't fun, don't do it. If you have to do it, make it fun. So maybe that's a good thing to go out on. Hey, it's been great to talk to you today, Jack. Nice to see you again, and I hope we meet again soon in person.
I hope we meet again soon in person, Mary Alice. I hope all goes well. You're heading off, I think, to Slovenia. I envy you that trip, the learning village. I'd love to be there. But whatever happens, we'll meet again, and the Youth and Elders is going to continue. I have a feeling it will, like ripples in a pond spreading out. Nice to talk.
Bye now.